Hello students, today we will look at the poem Preludes by T.S. Eliot. This poem, Preludes, is prescribed for the students of BA Part 3, English Literature in Paper 1, Poetry and Drama. But before we look at the poem, let us take a look at the biography of T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, he was born in 1888 and he died in 1965. Thomas Stearns Eliot was born in St. Louis, Missouri on September 26, 1888. He lived in St. Louis during the first 18 years of his life and attended Harvard University. In 1910, he left the United States for the Sorbonne. Sorbonne is a university, having earned both undergraduate and master's degrees and having contributed several poems to the Harvard Advocate. After a year in Paris, as I said, Sorbonne is a university and it is situated in Paris. So after a year in Paris, he returned to Harvard to pursue a doctorate in philosophy, but returned to Europe and settled in England in 1914. The following year, he married Vivian Haywood and began working in London, first as a teacher and later for Lloyd's Bank. It was in London that Eliot came under the influence of his contemporary Ezra Pound, who recognized his poetic genius at once and assisted in the publication of his work in a number of magazines, most notably the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock in Poetry in 1915. His first book of poems, Prufrock and Other Observations, was published in 1917 and immediately established him as a leading poet of the avant-garde. Avant-garde means the elite class. With the publication of The Wasteland in 1922, now considered by many to be the single most influential poetic work of the 20th century, Eliot's reputation began to grow to nearly mythic proportions. By 1930, for the next 30 years, he was the most dominant figure in poetry and literary criticism in the English-speaking world. As a poet, he transmuted his affinity for the English metaphysical poets of the 17th century, most notably John Donne. You may remember that you studied the poems of John Donne when you were in BA Part 1. And the 19th century French symbolist poets, including Baudelaire and Lafort, into radical innovations in poetic technique and subject matter. His poems in many respects articulated the disillusionment of a younger post-World War I generation with the values and conventions, both literal and social, of the Vatican era. As a critic also, he had an enormous impact on contemporary literary taste, propounding views that after his conversion to Orthodox Christianity in the late 30s, this is 1930s we are talking about, were increasingly based in social and religious conservatism. His major later poetry collections include Ash Wednesday, 1930, and Four Quartets, 1943. His books of literary and social criticism include The Sacred Wood, 1920, The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism, 1933, After Strange Gods, 1934, and Notes Towards the Definition of Culture, 1940. Eliot was also an important playwright whose verse dramas include Murder in the Cathedral, The Family Reunion, and The Cocktail Party. He became a British citizen in 1927, long associated with the publishing house of Faber and Faber. He published many younger poets and eventually became director of the firm. After a notoriously unhappy first marriage, Eliot separated from his first wife in 1933 and remarried Valerie Fletcher in 1956. T.S. Eliot received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1948. He died in London on January 4th, 1965. This is the brief biography of T.S. Eliot. Now let us look at the poet Preludes by T.S. Eliot. I have given you the text of the poem. You can go through the text. And now let us come to the actual poem itself. The introduction. T.S. Eliot wrote Preludes between 1910 and 1911 while he was a student in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then in Paris. The poem was included in Eliot's breakout 1917 collection, Prufrock and Other Poems, but it was first published in the second issue of Blast, the influential modernist magazine, alongside the works of Ezra Pound and Wyndham Lewis. The poem is a series of vignettes. A vignette is a brief evocative description, account or episode. In other words, the poem has many short episodes of alienated and desperate life in the modern city. There are 4 such pieces in the poem. It is an important example of early modernism, both in subject and in style. Eliot drew on the earlier French writers Charles Louis Philippe and Charles Baudelaire in choosing to write about the life of the slums in the modern city. Now, slums उस क्षेत्र को कहते हैं जिसको शायद आप समझते होंगे ये शब्द झुग्गी झोपड़ी जो होता है, झुग्गी झोपड़ियाँ यानी कि कच्चे झोपड़ियाँ बनी हुई होती हैं जहाँ पे गरीब तबके के लोग रहते हैं. In style, he was experimenting with the techniques of imagist poetry, a movement founded by his friend Ezra Pound. These included an emphasis on clarity and economy. Preludes begins with a regular form and rhyme scheme, which is then disrupted with fragments of free verse. Divided into 4 numbered sections, each of which describes a different city scene. Preludes can be read as 4 distinct poems with repeated words and themes. The main theme it examines is time in the modern city and how it organizes a monotonous means dull, debased existence for urban workers. Debased means something that has no value. In the 4th prelude, the poem grapples, means struggles, with a religious vision that becomes intertwined with the imagist project, but ultimately rejects it, returning to a bleak image at the end. Preludes is made up of 4 poems written by the modernist poet T.S. Eliot between 1908 and 1912, when Eliot was in his early 20s. They were later collected in Eliot's Debut Prufrock and Other Observations in 1917. Debut means the first. public appearance of something. Here we are talking about his first publication of a collection of poems. Broadly speaking, Preludes is about the drudgery, waste, and isolation of modern urban life. The unnamed city in which the poem is set is a grimy, dingy place. Dingy means dark and dull, in which people unthinkingly partake in monotonous daily routines. Prelude summary. Now we will take the four separate sections of the poem individually and read the summary of each of them one by one. So, section 1 or poem 1. The evening begins to quiet down, signaled by the smell of steaks cooking. Steaks is a meat dish which wafts through side streets. It is 6 o'clock. The end of the day is smoky, like the burnt out stubs of used cigarettes. And now the rain and wind blow the dirty scraps of dead leaves around your feet, along with thrown away newspapers blown through empty, undeveloped plots of land. The rain can be heard beating on broken blinds and chimney pots, and at a street corner there is a lonely cab horse, cab means taxi, steaming in the old and stamping its hooves. And then gas-powered street lamps are lit. Now, cab horse, in olden days, people could not afford cars, so there were horse-drawn carriages, बग्गियाँ होती थी जो लोग किराए पे लेते थे, जैसे तांगा होता है कुछ उस तरीके से. So that is a cab horse. And then gas-powered street lamps are lit. Poem 2. The morning begins to wake up with the stale but not too strong smell of beer from the street, which is covered with sawdust that has been trampled by muddy feet rushing to buy an early coffee. Along with all the other illusions that daily routine makes people go through again, one is also prompted to think about all the hands pulling up dirty blinds in thousands of furnished rooms all over the city. Poem 3. You threw the blanket off of your bed, lay on your back, and waited for something to happen. You dozed and watched the night reveal thousands of perverted, squalid images. Squalid means dirty, bad. Images that in fact make up your soul. They could be seen flickering on your bedroom ceiling. Flickering means जब रोशनी झपकती है तो वो उससे जो हिलती हिलती जो इमेज होती है वो फ्लिकरिंग कहलाती है. And when you woke up and the world became familiar again, you could see the light peeking through the window shutters and hear sparrows tweeting in the gutters outside. But at that moment, you experienced a vision of the street, which was so strange that even the street could hardly understand it. At the time, you were sitting on the edge of your bed, curling your hair, or perhaps you were holding your yellowing feet in your hands. Now, yellow feet are yellow because of the cold, maybe. They go pale. Poem 4. His soul has spread out tightly across the skies, which could be seen fading as the sun set behind a city block. This soul was also trampled by hurrying feet at 4, 5, and 6 o'clock. At these times, one can also see stubby fingers stuffing pipes with tobacco. Pipes जो चिलम होता है जिसमें अफीम का चूरा भर देते हैं, टोबैको, और फिर उसको प्रज्वलित करते हैं तो वो उससे आप जो चिलम फूंकते हैं लोग सिगरेट का एक पुराना फॉर्म है. Evening newspapers on sale and eyes looking around with expressions of self assurance. Beneath all this, the street has a conscience which wants eagerly to come forth, means to come out into the world. I am moved by the ideas that I have associated with these images, ideas that are difficult to get rid of. Above all, the vague notion of something that is infinitely gentle but which is always suffering. When your hands cross your mouth and laugh at the thought of what I have just described, wipe your hands. The worlds will go on following their cycles like old women who can be seen collecting fuel in empty, undeveloped plots of land. Now, the line wise explanation of the poem in detail. Poem 1, lines 1 to 4. The winter evening settles with smell of steaks and passageways. 6 o'clock, the burnt out ends of smoky days. Preludes begins with a juxtaposition. Juxtaposition means when two opposites are brought together. The first line establishes an almost romantic tone of by personifying the winter evening as settling down and relaxing, which might lead the reader to expect a poem focused on the calming joys of nature. However, line 2 goes immediately in another direction, evoking quite the opposite. The smell of steaks in passageways is something resolutely, absolutely urban. Urban yani ki shehri. The abrupt third line, 6 o'clock, then abruptly cuts short any illusions of this being a reflective nature poem. Instead, it is located firmly within a modern industrialized city with routines structured around the clock. The poem thus almost immediately destabilizes readers' expectations. In a way, the poem positions its readers in a state similar to that of the people the poem will go on to describe, a state in which they lack control over their own lives and feel swept up by the bustling city surrounding them. Bustling means busy, where there is a constant movement. शहरों में आवाजाही बहुत होती है लोगों की, कुछ कुछ लोग कर रहे होते हैं, सारे वक्त लोगों को चैन नहीं है, ज़िंदगी की जद्दोजहद में लड़ते रहते हैं. The fourth line, the burnt out ends of smoky days, echoes the second line's images of steaks cooking, which produce smoke, with its metaphor comparing smoky evenings to the burnt out ends of cigarettes. This is also the first reference to trash in the poem. Trash means kachra. सिगरेट स्मोक करके या सिगरेट पीने के बाद जो लास्ट में बच जाता है वो कचरा ही तो होता है. Which views urban life primarily as composed of what is thrown away rather than what is created. The heavy use of sibilance in these lines. Sibilance means when the S sound is repeated. S की आवाज़ जो आती है. Settles, smell, steaks, passageways, 6 smoky days, mimics the sizzling sound of steaks frying as well as the inhalations and exhalations. Inhalations means सांस अंदर लेना, exhalations meaning सांस छोड़ना, of smokers, positioning the reader among the city sounds being described. As with the natural imagery in line 1, perhaps the relatively familiar meter is meant to lull the reader into a false sense of security, to make readers think they are getting into a classical, regularly structured poem. It may also be meant to imitate the repetitive routineness seen as essential to city life. However, the short line 3 violently disrupts this rhythm and is just the first of many such lines to do so, indicative of the way that the structure of urban life, with its designated working hours, interrupts natural rhythms. Lines 5 to 8. And now a gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves about your feet and newspapers from vacant lots. The poem continues to paint a dirty and dismal city scene. The weather is grim, but not out of the ordinary or awe-inspiring in its might. A gusty shower is no epic storm. यानी कि हवा के साथ जो बारिश आती है, that is gusty shower. Instead, it is something typical, certainly unpleasant, but ultimately forgettable. Images of trash, मैंने पहले भी बताया, उसका मतलब होता है कचरा, also abound in these lines. Grimy scraps of withered leaves and thrown away newspapers from vacant lots. Vacant lots means undeveloped real estate, यानी कि ज़मीन के टुकड़े जिस पर कोई बिल्डिंग अभी बनी हुई नहीं है. Vacant यानी कि खाली. Lots means pieces of land. These images further evoke ideas of death. Scraps can also refer to the uneaten bones of animals. A living thing withers when it is long dead. The usefulness of newspapers dies soon after publication when the news they relate becomes old hat. Old hat means पुरानी खबर हो जाती है. तो अखबार पढ़ने के बाद फेंकने में ही आता है. And vacant lots are pieces of land that have gone to seed. Gone to seed मतलब बेकार हो गए हैं. अब उनका कोई उपयोग नहीं रहा. All in all, the speaker clearly does not have much affection for urban life. यानी कि उनको शहरी जीवन पसंद नहीं है. The rhyming couplet of raps and scraps in lines 5 and 6 is a compression of this whole idea and suggests that the city has a deadening effect on the people who live there. The city dweller is wrapped as if clothed or bandaged entirely in discarded objects, which conceal their natural humanity and originality. The enjambment here further echoes this idea of being wrapped up, excuse me, with each line spilling over or perhaps wrapping over onto the next. A gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves about your feet and newspapers. Line 7's reference to your feet is also the first mention of a human being in the poem, and also the first of many uses of synedosh. Synedosh is a figure of speech in which a part is made to represent the whole or vice versa, as in England lost by 6 wickets, meaning the English cricket team. This technique dehumanizes the people being described, referring only to their body parts rather than any distinguishing feature of a particular individual. The poem sees city dwellers as an inseparable mass who simply follow routines without really thinking about them. The meter of these lines continues in the iambic tetrameter begun the lines above, with a few exceptions. Line 6 is written in dimeter, meaning there are just 2 beats in this line, the grimy scraps. This line is thus much shorter than those that surround it. The same was true of line 3, 6 o'clock, and will be true of line 9, the Shah's beat. The insertion of these shortened lines destabilizes the meter, forcing the reader to constantly readjust their reading of the poem. Lines 9 to 13. The Shah's beat on broken blinds and chimneys, pots, and at the corner of the street a lonely cab horse steams and stamps, and then the lighting of the lamps. The final lines of poem 1 begin with a depiction of rain beating against broken blinds and chimney pots. Now, blinds here means कांच के करीब 1 से 1.5 इंच की पट्टियाँ खिड़कियों पे लगाई जाती थीं एक एंगल पे मतलब थोड़ा तिरछा. उससे हवा अंदर आ सकती है और थोड़ी बहुत रोशनी आ सकती है, लेकिन पूरी तरीके से वो खिड़की नहीं खुलेगी. They are blinds. So the blinds are broken. The use of alliteration of beat, broken blinds, and the plosive P of chimney pots echo the sounds made by droplets of rain striking hard objects, almost making this into a moment of onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia means the repetition of any one sound. These lines also have the most extensive use of end rhyme in poem 1. Beat and street rhyme and also rhyme with feet in line 7, as do stamps and lamps. The first set of rhymes combined with the B alliteration means the repetition of the sound B. Mimic means copy the sound of rain beating down and of feet striking the pavement. पेवमेंट मीन्स वो साइड वॉक, सड़क के किनारे जो चलने वाला हिस्सा होता है उसको पेवमेंट कहते हैं. पुट डिफरेंटली, द इंसिस्टेंट ईट EET sound itself evokes the repetitive beat of the rain or of those footsteps on the ground. The second set of rhymes, stamps and lamps, connect the stamping of cab horses with the lighting of gas street lamps, almost as if the former, means the cab horse, is a signal for the latter. Latter here refers to the gas street lamps. उनको जलाया जाता है क्योंकि शाम के 6 बज चुके हैं, अंधेरा हो रहा है. Polysydenton means the repetition of conjunctions in close succession, as in we have ships and men and money. अब conjunction क्या होता है? कंजक्शन वो शब्द होता है जो दो अन्य शब्दों को या एक सेंटेंस के अलग अलग भागों को या दो सेंटेंसेस को जोड़ता है. जैसे कि उसका एक एग्जाम्पल है एंड. सो अगर बार बार कंजंक्शंस का यूज़ किया जाए उसे पॉलीसिडेंटेंट कहते हैं. एंड एट द कॉर्नर एंड देन द लाइटिंग is also used in lines 11-12 in reference to the impatient stamping of the cab horse and the lighting of the street lights. This repetition creates the sensation of a mindless routine. यानी कि ज़िंदगी चल रही है, ये काम रोज़ होते हैं, उसमें कोई उत्साह नहीं है लोगों में. This happens, then this happens, followed out of blind habit. यानी कि आदत है इसलिए लोग काम करते हैं. The only emotional reaction is that of the horse, which feels lonely. The subtle implication is that human beings are already too alienated to feel anything about their situation at all. Alienated मतलब हम एक दूसरे से बहुत दूर हो चुके हैं. हमारे बीच करीबी नहीं रही, आत्मीयता नहीं रही. Poem 1 ends with alliteration on the I sound, lighting of the lamps. Light traditionally symbolizes knowledge, so this phrase might hint that a sort of awakening is about to occur. Occur means take place. That the city dweller might make some sort of conscious recognition of this dismal state might realize how terrible this life is. Of course, this does not come to pass. ऐसा नहीं होता है unfortunately. इस सेक्शन को हम यहीं छोड़ते हैं. पोएम 2 हम कल डिटेल में नेक्स्ट सेशन में डिटेल में देखेंगे. थैंक यू.